The idea, I think, behind these evening lectures online is to take something that some of us have an interest in, a hobby in, whatever, and to allow us to expand a bit. And so that's why I'm doing this particular one. So starting with a question, and this is a question I think that is where this all centers on. Here comes John Griffiths and Stephen as well. Uh, how did groups of Christians known today as churches of Christ come to be throughout the world? Now, the easy answer, and it's the one you often hear, particularly from Americans, is that it's all due to Americans going throughout the world. Now, I do not know the history of all congregations throughout the world and how they came to be there. And I'm sure many countries owe a lot to Christians from the United States bringing the good news of Jesus to their country. And we can be thankful that through the years, missionary outreach from the United States has led many to go to various areas of the world. And as a result, there are congregations in countries where there might not otherwise be. But having said that, I've heard those from America say to those of us in the UK, you all are just a product of the Stone Campbell movement. And those that were listening to this person had no idea who Stone and Campbell were. And such a statement is so far from the truth. I think it would be foolish to think that churches of Christ are an American phenomenon that has spread through the world due to American missionaries. And one of the problems with that view, that it all sprang from Alexander Campbell and Barton W. Stone, is that there are congregations in the United Kingdom that date to before they were even born. And so they obviously could not have had anything to do with starting those. Dean Walker, who wrote the preface to A.C. Waters' History of the British Churches of Christ, had this to say. He said, the story of Churches of Christ in Great Britain is of particular value in correcting an error which has persisted for some time, that the movement is peculiarly American. Alexander Campbell was at considerable pains to point out the fact that the movement was as much native to Britain as to America. So much for Alexander Campbell being the one that started it. In the United States, now there were two recognized leaders of the effort to get back to the Bible in the United States. One was Barton W. Stone on the right of your photo, your picture there. He was in Kentucky. There was a great revival in the early 1800s centered at Cane Ridge. And I wish I had time to talk about that because it's fascinating. Then there was Alexander Campbell. Campbell was an immigrant from Northern Ireland by way of Scotland to the United States, and his influence was centered in the very small town of Bethany, Virginia, now Bethany, West Virginia. And he established a college there to train men. That college is still going on today. But that's not the way it happened in the United Kingdom, although there were men who became known as leaders among the congregations. In Britain, what we find are numerous groups arising independently of each other, some springing up, and a generation later, they were gone. Waters, in his history of the British Churches of Christ, said this: the earliest congregations in Britain sprang up without knowledge of each other in various parts of England, Ireland, Wales, Scotland, England, Ireland, and Wales. Nor did they know for more than 20 years of the similar churches in similar churches in America. This suggests that the times must have been ripe for such a religious movement. So what we have in Britain is lots of things springing up all over the place, and usually very much independent of each other. These were the initial sparks, but it took a number of years for the sparks to burst into flames that's led to where we are today. William Robinson, in his book, What Churches of Christ Stand For, said this: the beginnings of Britain are more difficult to trace. They're not so localized as in America, and growth has been by no means so rapid. There are some churches still in existence whose history goes back well into the last half of the 18th century. And there are men who have been very influential in this country through the years. Men such as William Jones and David King and Thomas Hughes Milner and Godfrey Kemp, Gilbert Tickle, Timothy Coop, James Wallace, Sidney Black, James Anderson, Lancelot Oliver, Joseph Bryant, and of course, Walter Crosthwaite, just to name a few. And some of those are in that photograph. Walter is not, because he's about 100 years later. But I hope possibly spend a few lectures in the future introducing some of these men to you as well. But this evening, I hope to look at some of the early attempts to get back to the Bible in the UK, concentrating on the 18th and early 19th centuries, although there's going to be a reference to some of what was happening in the 17th century. So, why am I presenting this? Well, I love history. And over the years, I've enjoyed studying the history of God's people. I remember hearing my dad talk about some of the history in the United States. In the early 1980s, I sat through a series of lectures by, I think his name was F.W. Maddox at Ohio Valley College. And I was thrilled to learn more detail by someone who'd spent many years studying the American side of the things. Although, like most Americans, he got a few things wrong. Moving to Glasgow in 1985 has given me access to some of the restoration history that took place in this area, as well as throughout Scotland. And over the years, I have been acquiring many of the journals and books written and published by British Christians in the 1800s. I have volumes from Lynn Channing's library, Andrew Gardner's library, Albert Winstanley's library, as well as some of the surplus from the British Bible School library when we needed to consolidate it when we moved to Northampton. This is a photograph of my historical section in my library. The top shelf, primarily works of Alexander Campbell, with a few others as well. And on the far right, the beginning of David King's publications. Second shelf down, British journals from the 1800s. Third down, British journals and books and biographies from the late 1800s and early 1900s. And then on the very far right, it starts the American section. The bottom shelf you can see in the photograph are my American publications. They actually extend to another shelf below that. And I say all of that to simply say, I have a love of history, and I have access to what was written by many Christian leaders in the 1800s, as well as books that were written about them. And I hope this is of interest to you as well. What I want to cover this evening is just some of those early sparks in Scotland, as well as some in England, Ireland, and Wales. So, as Waters says, as he opened his book on page 5, he said, this section will deal chiefly with movements in Scotland in the 18th century, and is to that country mainly that the churches of Christ owe their origin. So we're going to start by talking about Scotland, and then we'll move on into England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And by the way, I'm very much indebted to A.C. Waters' book, The History of the British Churches of Christ, as well as the book that John Rennick published before his death, Reformation to Restoration. Although I couldn't find my copy of his book, but he gave me his manuscript before it was published. So my quotes or references are to the manuscript. And that's what I took, the bits I've taken are out of that. But to understand what led to the religious thinking in Scotland, you must first understand what was going on. Oh, there's John Rennick. Sorry, I forgot to flick his picture up there. John and I used to co-teach together at the British Bible School. But you have to understand what's been going on in Scotland. King James VI of Scotland became King James I of England in 1603. And he led to the authorized version of the Bible being translated and released in 1611. In 1683, the Presbyterian form of worship became the accepted form of church government in the Church of Scotland, as after a lot of debate. The union of the English and Scottish parliaments in 1707, though, led to many more changes. The secular side of life in Scotland, which had been repressed by the political and religious turmoil, began to come out. Leading minds were devoted to literature, philosophy, political economy, industry, and commerce. But this also began to invade religious thought, with the emphasis not on redemption and a changed life, but on a culture saturated with secularism. This became the majority view among Scottish church leaders, who became known as the moderates. Those who opposed them were known as the evangelicals, not the same group we have today, but these are the ones in the 1700s. They held the old, what's known as the old reforming and covenanting ideals. The majority of the people remained evangelical in their outlook. In 1712, the churches lost the right to appoint their own ministers. That was due to the Union of Parliament, which set aside what was known as the Act of Security and restored what was known as patronage. For about 20 years after that, the patrons and the presbyteries were careful to appoint ministers that were acceptable to the people. So there was peace. But in 1731, the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland passed an act that stated in the event of a minister vacancy, those selecting the new minister would not be the people, but the heritors, being Protestants, and the elders. And it so happened that these were also the wealthy landowners. The evangelicals regarded this as a surrender of the rights of the congregation. And that's where things began to, I guess we could say, become rebellious. Ebenezer Erskine, along with 3 other leaders of the evangelicals, denounced the act, and they were expelled from being ministers in 1732. In 1733, they founded the Secession Church and formed what they called an associated presbytery. They began in 1733 with one congregation, less than 1,000 people, and it increased to 120 congregations and around 100,000 people by 1765. By 1800, there were 200 congregations. Now, doctrinally, the secession churches were Calvinistic. They were devoted to predestination, but they still have an influence on the leaders that became leaders amongst the churches of Christ. These people were known as the seceders, and they had a breach in 1749, a split on whether burgesses could take an oath and whether it could be supported. That divided the church into 2 factions, the burghers and the anti-burghers. And they further divided in 1799 on a dispute about making the Solemn League and Covenant a term of whether someone could take communion. That all centered on the connection between church and state. Those who accepting that were called the Newlights or Newlights. They were open to new interpretations. Those who opposed it were the Old Lichts. And that division, though, was healed in 1842. But this had an influence on leaders in what is known by some as the Restoration Movement, particularly in the United States. Thomas Campbell, the father of Alexander Campbell, was a minister in Ulster for nearly 20 years before sailing to America. He was an anti-burgher, Auld Licht minister, and he tried unsuccessfully to heal the rift between the burghers and the anti-burghers. The Irish were willing to heal it. Those in Scotland were not. And so even though they didn't contribute a lot, they contributed some to some of the thinking of some of the early people that we know about. By the way, there's in Stirling, you can see the Erskine Memorial Church that was built. That's where they worship, the Secessionist Church worshipped. If you've got really good eyesight, you'll discover that that is now a youth hostel. And in front of it is a memorial to Ebenezer Erskine. Well, that led to another group springing up, and they're known as the Relief Church. This came about in 1751 when Thomas Gillespie, minister of the Carnock Parish Church near Dunfermline, was forced out by the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland for refusing to carry out their instructions to assist in the induction of a new minister in Inverkeithing. The patrons wanted the new minister. The congregation did not, and he sided with the congregation. Gillespie was supported by the people, but he had to start preaching in fields until a new building was built in Dunfermline. Something similar happened in Jedburgh when the congregation did not get their choice of a new minister. So they built a new building to meet in with their choice, who was Thomas Boston. Happened in Collinsborough as well, and Thomas Collier became the dissenting minister. These three came together in 1761, since they had three that were formed very similarly, and formed what is known as the Presbytery of Relief, and the relief there being relief from patronage. The Relief Church cherished ideas of open communion. A.C. Waters, in his history, wrote, sorry, I did not put that one in there, wrote, the communion table, said they, is spread not for burgher or the anti-burgher, not for the independent or the Episcopalian, not for the churchman or the dissenter, but simply for the Christian. The Relief Presbytery grew from 3 congregations to 19 in 12 years. They merged with the United Secession Church in 1847. You can see that on the right-hand side of this graph that I found on Wikipedia today. And they formed the United Presbyterian Church. Now, one thing we can see in these early movements is a thought process that did not think exclusively and denominationally, but thought with the idea that congregations should be somewhat self-controlling and that communion should be open to everyone. Now, they weren't there yet, but what we see is people getting back towards a biblical viewpoint. Another dissenting preacher and leader was Jon Glass from Dundee, widely regarded as the father of Scottish Congregationalism. In 1728, after hearing before the General Assembly, he was removed from being a minister of the Church of Scotland in Teeling because some of the things he was teaching. He appealed. His appeal was heard in 1729, and his being deposed was confirmed in 1730. So he began a congregation in Dundee in the home of Baillie George Lyon, and that was the first Glassite congregation. It started with 2 elders, himself and a chap named Francis Archibald. 2 more elders being appointed very soon. Within a few years, congregations following his leadership were formed in Dundee, in Perth, and in Edinburgh. It was in Edinburgh that a 16-year-old student named Robert Sandeman became part of the congregation. He later married Glass's eldest daughter, Catherine, and he became an elder in 1744 in Perth. And he had a great influence on the Glassite movements, also sometimes referred to as the Sandemanian movement. It was through his preaching and his writing that the Glassite teachings spread throughout England, Wales, and to New England in the United States. Sandeman eventually immigrated to the United States, and he died in Danbury, Connecticut. The Glassites adopted a congregational form of church government. They're among the first truly independent movements in Scotland. Now, this was never a widespread or popular movement, but they caused quite a stir amongst the religious people in Scotland, and they exercised an influence on many through the writings of John Glass and, of course, through Robert Sandeman. And many of Glass's beliefs were incorporated into other religious movements. So they do have an influence on what's going on as people try to get back to the Bible. The chapel, by the way, in Dundee is still there, and it's octagonal. I believe, if I remember right, it had a sign on the door that it was something to do with the council now. But William Robinson, in What the Churches of Christ Stand For, wrote this. He said, in one sense, The churches in this country owe their origin to the Glassites or Sandemanians. John Glass was a Presbyterian minister of the established Church of Scotland, who was deposed in 1730 for opposing state alliance. Robert Sandeman was his son-in-law, and both pleaded for a return to the simple beliefs and ways of New Testament Christians. So you can see there's a lot of things going on there that would strike a chord with us. Now, the foundation of what they believed and taught was based on the Bible being what Christians are to follow. John Glass, Waters quoted John Glass, and this is what John Glass wrote in, I couldn't find volume 5 of his work, so I quoted Waters there. Volumes 1, 2, 3, and 4, by the way, are available free online. But it's Glass says that the scriptures of the Old Testament, as Christ and his apostles received them from the Jews and gave them to Christians, with the scriptures of the New Testament, as we have them handed down to us, contain the complete revelation of the whole counsel of God and are the perfect rule of the Christian religion, which is still to be found pure and entire in these. Although he acknowledged that publishing what they believed might be useful for what those wanting to know what they stood for, he really didn't believe in creeds or confessions, that they had any authoritative value. It's said that the best statement of his beliefs was found in his book, The Testimony of the King of Martyrs. And these are the 2 books that I have in my library by John Glass. You know, I did pick up a copy of The Testimony of the King of Martyrs some years ago, published in 1813. The Glassites took the Lord's Supper each week, but a person had to be part of the congregation to be able to take it. They had elders and deacons in each congregation, and there needed to be a plurality of elders. Again, John Glass, quoted by Waters, said, the written tradition establishes, speaking about the New Testament, establishes a plurality of bishops in every church. And we may as well seek for one chief deacon as for one chief presbyter in any church there. I like the way he put that. But elders could work and still be an elder, but if needed, he said the congregation could support them. If a congregation did not have elders, the congregation was not viewed as being complete, and as a result could not observe, as he put it, the institutions and discipline appointed by Christ. In other words, they couldn't have the Lord's Supper, amongst other things, or exercise any congregational discipline. I was able to visit the Sandemanian church building in Edinburgh in 1985. And at that point, they had ceased to have the Lord's Supper because they didn't have an elder who could be there. If I remember right, there was one left and the others had died. Deacons, by the way, were to serve in practical ways, in particular helping the poor, while elders had the responsibility of teaching God's word. His view on baptism, though, was similar to the Presbyterians. It was connected with the death and resurrection of Jesus. It did involve purification of sinners by Jesus' blood, but as he put it, it's for believers and their children, which meant infant baptism was also practiced. Any qualified male Christian could teach, even if they weren't officially ministers, and that was pretty radical for that day. He insisted on no distinction between what is often referred to as clergy and laity, and he disagreed with the use of titles. He believed that fellowship and social interaction was vital for a Christian. Their worship was modeled on Acts 2:42. That, by the way, is the interior of the Sandemanian building in Edinburgh. But modeled on Acts 2:42, the apostles' teaching, fellowship, breaking of bread, and prayers. And Glass understood fellowship to at least include the regular contribution of Christians to meet the needs of the contribution and especially to help the poor. The fellowship collection was taken immediately before the Lord's Supper. If you turned around in this building, I couldn't find those pictures that I took, but if you turned around, you'd see as you walked out, there were two boxes mounted to the wall, and one of the boxes had a label on it, the Poor Collection. They also practiced what they referred to as a love feast, and that was a meal that they ate together that took place between the morning and the afternoon worship. When Buddy Burns and I visited the St. Dominion building in Edinburgh, the woman who was the caretaker showed us around. Buddy had contacted her, made the appointment, and then took us back to where she was cooking the love feast for the next day, which was a pot of lentil soup, and offered us each a bowl of it, which we, by the way, gladly accepted. They also practiced greeting each other with a holy kiss, as well as foot washing. Now, Waters suggested that the foot washing especially may be why this movement never became popular, and dissenters were excommunicated. You may have heard of Michael Faraday, scientist, early pioneer in electricity. He was a glassite. I remember I have one of his biography of his, and it mentions his religious and aspects to his life and how important that was to him. John Glass himself died in 1773. He's buried in the Old Howth Cemetery in Dundee, and you can go there today and see his monument. I've done that. And his monument says, John Glass, minister of the Congregational Church in this place, died November 1773, aged 78 years. And at the bottom of his stone, it says this: his character in the churches of Christ is well known and will outlive all monumental inscriptions. And although his monument is still there, his character is still known. As a movement, the Glassites have now died out. Waters wrote that in the 1940s, when he was writing, there were 4 congregations left in the United Kingdom, 2 not speaking with the other 2. When we visited in 1985, I believe it was the only congregation left. And even though they have died out, the teaching of Glass still had an influence on many, and in particular, the Scotch Baptists. John Rennick wrote, there can be no doubt that Glass's influence was tremendous. Certainly, it was out of all proportion to the size of the number of congregations established. In Scotland, congregational churches after the order of John Glass existed in Aberdeen, Arbroath, Cooper, Dundee, Dunkeld, Edinburgh, Galashiels, Glasgow, Guthrie, Leith, Leslie, Paisley, and Perth. Glass was a diligent Bible student, proficient in Hebrew and Greek, and well acquainted with the worlds of the great religious writers down through the centuries. His own literary output was enormous, and I've been able to find 2 volumes in used bookstores, tells us that his output was enormous. But the Glassites, John Glass and his teachings, had a profound influence on the Scotch Baptists. The founders of the Scotch Baptist movement were Archibald MacLean and Robert Carmichael. And I scoured everywhere, could not find a photograph of Robert Carmichael. Archibald MacLean you can find on Wikipedia. So therefore, most of the photos that I'm using today are either my own or used under the Creative Commons license on the Wikimedia Commons. But MacLean and Carmichael both had a connection with the Glassites, although it was very brief. MacLean, by the way, was born in East Kilbride in 1733. He eventually became a printer in Glasgow. MacLean was part of a Glassite congregation from 1762 to 1765, and that came about after correspondence with Robert Sandeman. Carmichael was an anti-burgher secessionist minister at Cooper Angus. He became a Glassite in 1762. He became one of the elders that year in the Glassite congregation in Glasgow. Both MacLean and Carmichael left the Glassites over a decision in a case of discipline, which they saw as being an injustice. We mentioned that's one of the tenets that John Glass held was very strict discipline. And MacLean also seemed to have had a disagreement with Glass over infant baptism. His published works reflect this. In 1767, he wrote a book called Letters to Mr. Glass in answer to his dissertation on infant baptism. The next year, 1777, a defense of believers' baptism. Then a few years later, 1786, the nature and import of baptism with its indispensable obligation, to which is added a short sketch of the church order and religious practices of the Baptists in Scotland, Edinburgh. So all that going on there. After they left Glass, before he started these discussions over infant baptism, Carmichael and MacLean began corresponding about infant baptism. John Rennick said this: in June 1764, Carmichael wrote to MacLean for his conclusion. MacLean replied saying that the ordinance was reserved for believers and that the mode was immersion. His judgment, he said, was based on his own study of the Bible. Carmichael remained unconvinced and continued in his former thinking, baptizing the newborn child of a colleague. But then Carmichael came to accept the scriptural view of baptism advanced by MacLean. By 1765, both were convinced that infant baptism had no foundation in God's word, and only believers should be immersed. They didn't know of anyone in Scotland, though, who baptized, although we know historically there was at least one at that time. So Carmichael went to London to be baptized. Upon his return a few weeks later, he immersed MacLean and a few other ex-Glassites in the water of Leith at Cannonmills, late in 1765. MacLean moved to Edinburgh in 1768, and he and Carmichael became elders in the First Scotch Baptist congregation. Over the next few years, Scotch Baptist congregations were started in Glasgow, Dundee, and Montrose. Carmichael died in 1774. MacLean remained one of their leaders until his death in 1812. By the end of the 1700s, there were congregations in Dunfermline, Galashiels, Newborough, Perth, Largo, Paisley, and Kirkcaldy. During the first 20 years of the 1800s, there were 40 new congregations started, mainly in small towns and villages, and Scotch Baptist churches could be found throughout the British Isles. The congregation we're most familiar with was the one in Kirkcaldy. The records show a starting date for this congregation of 1798, but that was really the date they appointed their first elders and became independent of the congregation in Edinburgh, who had been overseeing their work. So we don't know precisely when they first began to worship in Kirkcaldy. Robert Hughes, who was one of the elders in that at Kirkcaldy at one point, and I knew him quite well in Kirkcaldy, he wrote a book for their 200th anniversary in 1998 called The Churches of Christ in the County of Fife, Scotland. In his research, he discovered that the congregation began meeting sometime between 1784 and 1786. He couldn't really narrow down any better than that. He said they initially met in Butte Wynd in Kirkcaldy and were known as the Baptist Society of Kirkcaldy. Now, I found this map on Wikimedia Commons of Kirkcaldy in around the 1820s, 1824. And I looked and looked. It wasn't huge at that point. I couldn't find Butte Wynd on that particular map. But in 1788, they leased and later purchased a hall at the back of Kirk Wynd, and they worshipped here until 1819. And if you notice there, if you can see well enough, there's a couple of halls, one on the right-hand side of the road and one on the left, that could very easily have been described as the back of that particular street. But by 1819, they'd outgrown that hall. So the Rose Street Chapel was built in 1819. That was just down the street somewhat from Kirk Wynd. And the building they built there in 1819 could seat about 200, and you could put an additional 40, it said, in the vestry. And these are photographs of photographs that I've taken, so they're not wonderful, but that's the interior of the building there up until about 1860 something other when it was remodeled. When it was remodeled, take it back, it's in 1939 it was remodeled, and that's what it looked like after that. and they remained meeting there until 1967. Um, in 1967, the council wanted the property, so it was demolished in 1967. And that time, the congregation moved to a church building given them by the council in exchange for the Rose Street Chapel property. And it was there on Hayfield Road in Kirkcaldy. And it met there until the last few years, just a couple of years ago. They did retain the preaching stand that had been in the Rose Street Chapel and put it in that particular property. Now, this was an unusual pulpit, if you want to call it that. I was asked to speak there, and so I noticed that it had not just the one sort of lectern you see in the middle, there are two more. And I said, which one should I speak from? They said, take your choice. It doesn't really matter. But various ones have been used over the years. There is David Murray. They had two of them up at that point in time, and the one in the middle was folded away. And that was a very flexible thing. This was the interior of their building. That's the last social that they had in the Kirkcaldy building on Hayfield Road. And it was pretty well packed that particular day. That was 2019, I think maybe 2018, 2019, someplace through there. But they have sold the building now, and they're now meeting next door in the community center. But I believe that the Kirkcaldy congregation is the oldest continuous existing congregation of Churches of Christ, probably in the world. But in the late 1700s, early 1800s, we find in Kirkcaldy what could be seen during this era throughout Scotland. As Robert Hughes put it, the area had been witnessing the growth of independent churches because many people had found problems in accepting the traditional beliefs of the established churches, causing them to break away in order to worship in accordance with their consciences. So that's what's going on in Scotland. A lot of independent church movements. The Scotch Baptist beliefs, by the way, as we saw earlier, they had rejected infant baptism for believers' baptism. Most of the other beliefs have been incorporated, including weekly Lord's Supper, which they also believed there had to be an elder present to have the Lord's Supper. But that particular belief led to a division later amongst the Scotch Baptists. In fact, it got to the point that Scotch Baptist congregations were asked to state which side they were on so that people could know who they were in fellowship with. About half were on one side, and about half were on the other. As Waters put it, it was obvious that peace-loving Christians in such circumstances would be apt to withdraw from membership, and this was an important factor in the rise of Churches of Christ in Britain. The Scotch Baptists believed that no human traditions could be a matter of faith, the New Testament being the sole authority on matters of faith and practice. They didn't view formal academic training as essential to being a preacher, although many of those working with the congregations were well trained. Each congregation was to be self-governing and autonomous. Discipline was strict and impartial to maintain purity. So I found that a bit interesting. They're sort of formed because they didn't like the strict discipline in one particular case from the Glassite group, and yet they still maintained the strict discipline and being very impartial. So they still maintained that. But there were divisions within the Scotch Baptist movement. The nature of the Godhead was an area of contention. There was disagreement over how many Christians it took to constitute a congregation. Because each congregation, though, was autonomous, these divisions were not widespread through the movement, but somewhat isolated into particular congregations. What happened to the Scotch Baptists? In the History of the Baptists in Scotland, Percival Wall wrote, the Scotch Baptist system crossed the border, and its churches in England numbered at least 20, not all existing at the same time, apart from a dozen in a Welsh group of which J.R. Jones of Ramouth was the leader. The most of them have verged to the common order. 3 or 4 survive in vigor in Lancashire, and a few joined the Churches of Christ, or Campbellite body of Baptists. Some in Scotland also united with the latter body before 1840, as at Auchtermuchty, Dumfries, Newmilns, and Stevenston. The Scotch Baptists did have a contribution to the thinking that has produced a lot of us who are sitting here. John Riddick says, like the churches of John Glass, the Scotch Baptists, for all the shortcomings, did arise with an eager desire to attain a pure and more ardent life that seemed possible in the established churches of that day. It's to their credit that they earnestly searched the New Testament for the primitive church order, believing that this was nearest to the mind of Christ, and so alone was legitimate. Unfortunately, they came to exalt the letter above the spirit. The lack of evangelical character finally caused the decline and extinction of these native religious movements. And those who have survived are the ones who became part of other movements. Another group that they influenced, had some influence over, we really have to mention as well, was the Haldane movement. Last part of the 18th century, a great evangelistic movement in Scotland centered on Robert and James Haldane. The problem was the existing religious bodies really had no evangelistic zeal or belief. It led to many wanting a better way. Robert and James Alexander Haldane were 2 brothers dissatisfied with part of the Church of Scotland, dissatisfied with the formalism, dissatisfied, as they put it, with the sterility, and with the institutionalism. So they decided to do something about it. And they established institutes for the training of young men to preach and evangelize. At the end of 1797, James Haldane, with some friends, organized the Society for Propagating the Gospel at Home, and was non-sectarian and interdenominational. The purpose was, as they put it, to make known the everlasting gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. The Haldanes broke with the Church of Scotland, organized an independent church in Edinburgh in 1799. They owned the Airdrie estate just outside of Stirling, Robert being the 3rd of Airdrie, he's known as on his biography. They sold the estate, and they used those funds to finance missions and to train the men to preach. Their house, by the way, still stands on the grounds of Stirling University, because they're the ones that now own it. There was an early disagreement amongst this new group on the subject of baptism. The Haldane brothers believed it should be done, and they were immersed. And that led to a division and 2 groups being formed. One gradually developed into the Congregational Church. The other became part of the Baptist Church Union. For quite a time, they held to Scotch Baptist ideals with its system of mutual ministry, but more and more returned to the idea of, in quotes, a one-man pastorate, one-man minister. Their beliefs as an independent movement included the weekly observance of the Lord's Supper, strict discipline, even examining their adherence on their biblical knowledge and purity of life. I found that one to be interesting. But the Haldanes are significant, not only because of their beliefs, but in their influence on others who became leaders amongst what is known as the Restoration Movement, particularly in the United States. Greville Ewing was one of the preachers for the Glasgow Tabernacle, later the preacher for one of the Congregational churches. He met a young man who'd been shipwrecked on the island of Islay, ended up in Glasgow for a year, and his name was Alexander Campbell. He introduced Campbell to the Haldanes while Alexander studied at Glasgow University in 1808. And when he completed his journey to the United States, he took with him the ideas of these men. But that's another story for another day. John Riddick says the success of the Haldane revival has been explained in terms of the following reasons: a conductive climate of the public mind, the ineffectuality of the churches, particularly the National Church of Scotland, the liberality of Robert Haldane, the spiritual fervor and energy of the missionaries, the firm grip of the evangelistic theory of the Haldanes, and the training of young preachers. Now, there are other small Scottish influences into movements that just sort of sprang up and died down. There is a group known as the Old Scots Independents that date from 1768. The early leaders of the Old Scots Independents were influenced by John Glass. They left the Church of Scotland over the problem of patronage. They disagreed with the civil magistrate having power in the churches. They held to the autonomy of local congregations under a plurality of elders, education not being a stipulation to be a minister, receiving any after a public profession of faith, and the Lord's Supper each Sunday. There was growth throughout Scotland in the Old Scots Independents, but there were also splits. And some of the splits I find to be incredible. There were differences over whether what is called the Lord's Prayer could be used in public worship. There are differences over whether the Amen should be said audibly by the congregation at the end of a public prayer. There are differences as to whether the congregation should stand for singing and prayers or not. And believe it or not, those led to major splits within the movement. John Riddick wrote that congregations of the OSIs were never numerous or large. As early as 1776, the subject of believers' baptism caused much controversy, and they lost many members to the Scotch Baptists. The OSIs accepted infant baptism. Perhaps the total membership never exceeded 500. A pamphlet introduced in 1835 attributed their decline to their non-evangelistic nature and the rise of the Haldane churches. So they sort of didn't teach themselves into growth, but taught themselves into obscurity by not teaching. There was a movement I've always found interesting up in Fettercairn in Kincardineshire in Scotland. That's just below Aberdeen. This was in 1773, lasted for about 70 years. The ruling principle was that the scriptures were the sole test of divine truth. They took their name from Acts 17:11. Congregations were independent, ministers were chosen without regard for human learning. John Riddick wrote that Berean meetings finally died out, the last being at Lawrence Kirk in 1844, or the William Taylor carried on in his own barn in Balmain. And we visited that barn in Balmain. I think we made the farmer a bit angry, but it has a little plaque on the side saying that it was a Berean meeting place. The last Bereans in Lawrence Kirk were two old ladies, one of whom upon the other's death said, if I can say this right, was me. When I gang to the Bereans, when I gang to the Bereans will be clean licked off. In other words, when I'm gone, there'll be no Bereans left. John's went on to say it's to their credit that wherever Berean congregations were planted, a taste for religious knowledge, the reading and study of the Bible began to prevail. Morality was improved, and temperance and the regulation of behavior came to the fore. The Bereans practiced a down-to-earth, homely religion that was fitted to their day-to-day lives. There was a congregation in 1807 that was begun in Auchtermuchty in Fife, not in this building, but that's an old building from that time period in Auchtermuchty. And again, it was on the principles of independency as advocated by the Haldanes. In 1809, 13 of its number were immersed in a river near the town and began a congregation of immersed believers. They remained independent of Baptist organizations and were interested in religious reform movements, both in the UK and in other areas of the world. In 1830, they learned of the work of Alexander Campbell, and one of their preachers traveled to America to visit with them and learned that they were advocating the same things. And this wasn't just going on in Scotland. This was going on in various places. In Dungannon, in Ireland, as early as 1804, a congregation of independents began breaking bread each first day of the week and established mutual teaching. One of their number, named Robert Tenner, was noticing that in missionary work, the converts were always immersed after believing. But he didn't know anyone who had immersed him in Ireland. A man named Robert Smith, after receiving his training to be a minister, returned to Dungannon and began studying the same subject. He heard of an old man in the county of Armagh who was a Baptist, and he went to him to be immersed. And when he returned, he immersed Robert Tenner and his wife and another man. And they formed a congregation of 4. And that very rapidly grew to 40. And again, they learned of Alexander Campbell, began to correspond with him, received his writings, and began to teach these principles in England and Scotland as well. We find in Wales, in Allington, a congregation known as the Church of Christ that was begun in 1809. But before that, this group had formed a Bible class and then began observing the Lord's Supper each week. In 1809, Charles Davies was immersed at the Baptist Church in Wrexham, and he baptized over 30 who were meeting there together in Allington. They grew, but it wasn't until 1835 that they knew of other congregations in the UK and USA who had the same views as they did. At Kirkby and Furness in the Lake District, a chapel was built in 1826, although they had to have been in existence before this. And they didn't discover other people with similar beliefs until 1854. Of course, most of us in the UK are familiar with Tuttlebank. Tuttlebank was a congregation that began in 1669. We have the minute book from that year, and their beliefs were listed. And amongst their beliefs were that they went by Church of Christ. Of course, it's been changed to Baptist Church today. They only practiced believers' baptism. That's their building. And just to the right of the building, I believe, is where their baptismal tank was. And they baptized. By the way, today, when you go in the building, there's a baptistry underneath the floor where they baptize people. But their emphasis in their meetings was on the Lord's Supper, and only those who had been immersed could partake of it. They had a congregational organization with elders and deacons, with one elder being supported as the teaching elder. They later adopted open communion, and the congregation in Kirkby severed fellowship with them. Okay, what does all of that tell us? What use is all that information to us today? We can see that there have been groups throughout the last 350 years, at least in the United Kingdom, who wanted to follow God's word and not accept what people had added to it. There is a uniformity in what they discovered. They discovered that they needed to take the Bible as the last word and what we should be doing as Christians. They saw the need for believers to be immersed and not children. They saw the need to remember Jesus' death through the Lord's Supper each Sunday. They saw it was important to have independent, autonomous congregations who could be joined in fellowship with other congregations with the same beliefs. And they saw the need for each congregation to have elders and deacons, and that there were no educational requirements needed in order to be able to declare God's word. And there is very much an emphasis on evangelism, on telling others what they had discovered. Many of these groups arrived at these conclusions and didn't know until much later that others had also arrived at them. There were sparks that were coming to life, but sadly, many of these sparks only flared up briefly and went out, sometimes because of divisions, largely over opinions, and sometimes because the fellowship was broken, the groups eventually died out. Those groups who have survived are those who recognize the need to follow God's word and to be in fellowship with others who are like-minded, even if there were occasional disagreements over opinions. Now, that, of course, is not the end of the story. As we saw, Alexander Campbell, though he didn't start this movement, was himself influenced by it, and he also influenced what was going on in the UK through his writings. One of the early publications, this copy of mine is from 1839, is a journal called The Christian Messenger and Reformer. Now, Alexander Campbell did not publish it over here, but notice that the articles are by Alexander Campbell. That's worth talking about in the future. And of course, Campbell's influence on such men as David King. David King's the one on the front row left of that photograph. He also influenced many others who became leaders in congregations in the United Kingdom in the 1800s. And that's a fascinating story in its own right. And perhaps we'll get to that in another day. Perhaps my best conclusion to this evening would be this: the principle that the Bereans adopted, the group that met up near Lawrence Kirk in Scotland. And their principle is this: it's Acts 17:11. These were more open-minded, for they eagerly received the message, examining the scriptures carefully every day to see if these things were so. May we remain open-minded, eagerly receiving God's word, and daily examining the scriptures carefully to see if what we are hearing, what we are learning, is true. And with that, I am finished.